somewhere in the stone heart of medieval France, in a monastery so small it does not appear on any map of consequence. A monk sat down one autumn morning and drew a cathedral. He was 22 years old. His hands were cold. The charcoal moved across the paper with the careful uncertainty of someone doing something for the first time, tracing the great western facade stone by stone, arch by arch, the two towers rising into a sky he could not fully see from where he sat. He finished the drawing, set it aside, and the next morning, without explanation, without instruction, he drew it again. He would draw that same cathedral 1,712 times before he died. For 47 years, through the reigns of 3 kings and the tenure of 11 abbots, through plague seasons and harvest seasons and winters so cold the ink froze in its bottle, Brother Anselm returned each morning to the same window, the same view, the same 2 towers ascending into whatever light the season offered. Around him, the world shifted and ground and burned and rebuilt itself. Wars were fought over borders he could not see from where he sat. Popes rose and fell. The great cities of Europe filled and emptied with the particular violence of the 14th and 15th centuries. And in the quiet of the monastery's eastern wing, a man pressed charcoal to paper and drew the same stones he had drawn the morning before. What he left behind was not a monument. It was not intended to be studied or preserved or understood by anyone who came after him. It was simply a life's work in the most literal sense, the accumulated record of one man's attention, offered to one place, across the whole long span of a human life. And when an archivist finally opened the chest where the drawings had rested undisturbed for nearly 4 centuries, lifting the first page carefully into the pale light of a November afternoon, what she found was something that no architect had commissioned, and no historian had anticipated: the slow, intimate, impossibly detailed autobiography of a cathedral, drawn from a single window, by a single pair of hands, across 47 unbroken years. There is a particular quality of light that exists only in very old stone rooms, a light that does not so much enter through the window as settle, the way dust settles, slowly and without announcement, spreading itself across the floor in long, pale rectangles that shift almost imperceptibly as the morning passes. It is not a bright light. It does not demand attention. It is the kind of light that makes you lower your voice without quite knowing why. The kind that turns ordinary objects into something quieter than themselves. A wooden table becoming more wooden. A clay cup becoming more still. The stone walls on either side releasing a coolness into the air that you feel not as a temperature, but as a presence. Something ancient and unhurried and completely indifferent to the passage of hours. If you have ever stood inside a very old church on a weekday morning, when there are no services and no visitors, and the only sound is the faint shifting of the building itself, then you will understand the quality of the room we are entering tonight. And if you have not, then perhaps tonight is the right occasion to learn what that feels like, from the inside of a story, which is sometimes the safest place to feel anything at all. Settle in. Now. Breathe out slowly. We are in no hurry. The cathedral stands in the eastern part of France, in a region whose name has changed several times over the centuries depending on who was drawing the maps and what language they preferred. In the time of our story, in the long middle stretch of the 1400s, it was known by a name that translated roughly as the Valley of the Quiet River, which is a name that suited it well, because the river that ran nearby was indeed quiet, moving slowly through a landscape of soft hills and pale farmland, reflecting the sky in the particular silver gray that part of France seems to produce more reliably than anywhere else. The cathedral itself had been standing for nearly 200 years by the time our story begins, which meant it had already outlived the men who designed it, and the men who built it, and the bishops who consecrated it, and had settled into that comfortable stage of a building's life where it no longer needed to announce itself, where its presence in the landscape was simply assumed, the way a very old hill is assumed, as something that was always there, and will continue to be there long after the current generation of visitors has gone home to their suppers. The western facade faced the town square, such as it was, a modest gathering of market stalls and stone houses that arranged themselves around the cathedral, the way small things arrange themselves around large things, not by design, but by gravity. by the simple fact that the cathedral was the largest and most permanent object in the vicinity, and everything else had grown up in its shadow over many decades. The two towers of the western facade rose to a height of roughly 42 meters, though the monks who lived in the adjacent monastery had no particular reason to measure them, and so they expressed the tower's height not in numbers, but in comparisons, saying that the towers were tall enough to catch the first light of morning before it reached the valley floor, and tall enough that on clear days a man climbing to the bell chamber could see the hills 3 days' walk to the east. The stone of the facade was a pale limestone, the kind that weathers to the color of old cream, taking on over the centuries a texture that is neither rough nor smooth, but somewhere between the two, a texture that catches light differently in the morning than in the afternoon, that appears almost luminous in overcast weather and takes on a deep warm gold in the last hour before sunset. To the east of the cathedral, sharing its long southern wall, sat the monastery. It was a small establishment by the standards of the time, housing at its peak no more than 30 monks, and more typically somewhere between 18 and 24, depending on the season and the particular fortunes of the region. The monastery had its own small chapel, its own kitchen garden, its own library of perhaps 300 volumes, and its own internal rhythms that ran parallel to the cathedral's liturgical calendar, but were in many ways quieter and more domestic, the rhythms of a household rather than an institution. The monks rose before dawn for the first of their daily prayers, and they retired after the final prayers of the evening, and between these 2 points they worked and studied and ate and walked in the small enclosed garden that occupied the center of the monastery's square floor plan. It was not a dramatic life. It was not intended to be. It was a life organized entirely around the removal of drama, around the proposition that repetition and quietness and the slow turning of days were not things to be endured, but things to be cultivated, the way a garden is cultivated, with patience and without expectation of sudden results. Tonight, we are going to walk slowly through one life lived inside that quietness. We are going to follow a man who spent 47 years in that monastery, who ate the same meals in roughly the same sequence, who heard the same bells at the same hours, who walked the same stone corridors in the same worn sandals, and who, every morning for nearly half a century, sat down at a particular window and drew what he saw. The story is not one of great discovery or heroic achievement. There are no battles in it, no journeys to distant places, no moments of sudden transformation. There is instead something rarer and perhaps more interesting, the story of a man who paid attention to one thing for a very long time, and what that kind of attention, offered patiently and without agenda, can leave behind. And if your eyes are already beginning to feel the welcome weight of the evening, if the sounds around you are growing soft and distant, that is exactly the right place to be as this story begins. You do not need to hold on to every detail. The story will carry you. That is what stories are for. The room where our story begins is on the eastern side of the monastery, on the second floor, at the end of a corridor that smells of beeswax and cold stone. The window in that room faces west, toward the cathedral's great facade, and in the morning the light comes through it at a low angle, falling across the wooden writing table in a long, pale stripe, warming the surface of the wood until it releases the faint smell of old timber, something between honey and dust. There is a candle on the table, low and steady, its flame barely moving in the still air of the room. There is a piece of paper on the table, and beside it a stick of charcoal, and beside that a hand, belonging to a young man named Anselm, who is 22 years old and has been in this monastery for 6 weeks, and is looking out the window at the cathedral's western facade with the particular quality of attention that he does not yet have a name for, but which will define the entire remaining course of his life. The morning is quiet. The light is settling. The story is beginning. Buildings do not begin with stone. They begin with a decision, which is itself preceded by a need. And the need that preceded this cathedral was one that most medieval communities eventually arrived at. The need to mark the place where they lived as a place worth marking, to build something that would outlast the individual lives of everyone involved in its construction, and stand in the landscape as a kind of permanent statement, not of wealth exactly, and not of power exactly, but of something harder to name. A collective insistence that this valley, this river, this particular arrangement of hills and farmland, was a place where something permanent had chosen to rest. The decision to build the cathedral was made sometime in the second half of the 1200s, in the years following a period of relative stability in the region, when the harvest had been adequate for long enough that there was something left over. Not just food, but time. Not just time, but ambition. The slow communal ambition that gathers in a place when survival is no longer the only item on the agenda. The bishop of the region at that time was a man of moderate temperament and considerable patience, qualities that proved more useful in the construction of a cathedral than any architectural knowledge he might have possessed. Since cathedral construction was above all else an exercise in patience, a project that no one involved in its beginning would live to see completed. The architect whose plans were eventually approved was from a city to the north, a man who had spent several years studying the great cathedrals then under construction in other parts of France, and had returned with notebooks full of measurements and observations, and a particular enthusiasm for the quality of light that could be achieved through the careful placement of windows. His name appears in the regional records as a series of slightly inconsistent spellings, the way names often appear in records from that period, when the person doing the writing was working from sound rather than from any agreed orthography. And so we know him primarily through the building he left behind, rather than through any reliable account of his person. What we can say is that he understood proportion, that he had thought carefully about the relationship between the height of the nave and the width of the aisles, and that he placed his windows with exactly the attentiveness he had promised, so that the interior of the cathedral received light in a sequence across the day that moved from east to west in a slow and almost theatrical progression. The altar illuminated at dawn, the nave filling gradually through the morning hours, and the western facade catching the last of the afternoon light in a way that turned the pale limestone a deep and resonant gold for the final hour before sunset. Construction began in the year 1261, or thereabouts, since the exact date appears differently in different sources, and the sources themselves are not entirely reliable on questions of chronology. The foundations were laid first, going down to a depth that surprised even the experienced stonecutters, since the ground in that part of the valley concealed a layer of soft clay beneath the topsoil that required the foundation trenches to go considerably deeper than originally planned. This delay was the first of many, and the construction proceeded over the following decades in the familiar rhythm of medieval building projects. Years of intensive work followed by periods of enforced pause, caused by lack of funds, by disease, by the death of key craftsmen, by the periodic interruptions of regional conflict, and by the simple grinding difficulty of moving very large quantities of very heavy stone across a landscape whose roads were not designed for the purpose. The west towers, which would eventually become the most recognizable element of the facade, were not completed until the middle of the 1300s, nearly a century after the foundations were first laid, and the men who finally set the capstones in place had grown up hearing stories about the cathedral from their grandfathers, rather than having any personal memory of its beginnings. By the time the cathedral could be considered substantially complete, the world around it had already changed considerably from the world in which it had been planned. The bishop who had approved the original design was long dead, as were his successors for several generations. The city to the north from which the original architect had come had itself changed hands twice during the intervening decades of regional politics. The community around the cathedral had grown, had contracted during the worst of the plague years in the middle of the 1300s, and had grown again, so that the town which now arranged itself around the cathedral's base bore only a partial resemblance to the town that had originally gathered to hear the first stones blessed. The cathedral, meanwhile, had accumulated its own history within its history, layers of repair and modification and addition, that meant the building standing in the 1400s was not precisely the building that had been designed in the 1200s, but something that had grown organically from that original intention, shaped by every generation that had lived alongside it, and found it necessary to change something, to add a chapel here, or repair a buttress there, or replace a window whose stone tracery had cracked in a particularly severe winter. This is the of very old buildings. They are not fixed things, despite their appearance of permanence. They are slow conversations between the original intention of their makers and the continuous present needs of the people who use them. Conversations conducted in the language of stone and mortar and timber. Conversations that never quite end as long as the building remains inhabited and cared for. The cathedral in our story had been having this conversation for nearly 200 years by the time Anselm arrived at the adjacent monastery. And in those 2 centuries it had accumulated a kind of depth that is difficult to describe, but easy to feel. The sense that the building held within its walls not just the prayers of the current generation, but the layered residue of every generation that had prayed there before. Every candle that had burned in its nave, every winter that had pressed against its walls from outside while warmth gathered within, every footstep on its stone floors from every person who had entered through its great western doors, with whatever combination of faith and need and ordinary human uncertainty they carried with them on any given day. The walls held all of it, or seemed to, in the way that very old walls seem to hold things. Not literally, not in any way that could be measured, but in a way that you feel as a quality of the air inside them, a heaviness that is not oppressive but settling, like a hand placed gently on the shoulder. And if your eyes are growing heavy now, if the details of these old stones are beginning to blur pleasantly at their edges, that is entirely as it should be. The cathedral has been standing for centuries, and it will continue to stand while you rest. The story is in no hurry. Outside the window, wherever your window is tonight, the world is doing what it always does in the quiet hours, settling into itself, the sounds softening one by one, the light long since gone, the dark comfortable and familiar. The cathedral stands in its valley. The river moves slowly past. The monastery is dark except for a single candle in a second-floor room, where a young man named Anselm is already asleep, and where in a few hours, when the bells ring for the first prayers of the morning, he will rise and wash his face in cold water and begin, for only the 7th time, to draw what he sees from his window. A monastery is, at its most essential, a machine for the regulation of time. Not time in the sense of clocks and appointments, which is the way we tend to think of time now, but time in the older and more patient sense, the movement of light across a day, the rotation of seasons through a year, the slow accumulation of days into a life that has been deliberately organized around the proposition that repetition is not the enemy of meaning, but its closest ally. The monastery attached to the eastern wall of our cathedral had been operating according to this principle for roughly 60 years before Anselm arrived, which meant it had already established the particular grooves of routine that give monastic communities their characteristic atmosphere, an atmosphere that visitors often describe as peaceful, and that the monks themselves would more accurately describe as simply usual, since peace implies the absence of disturbance, and what the monastery offered was something more fundamental than that. A structure so complete and so consistent that disturbance had very little room to enter in the first place. The bells rang at the same hours, the meals appeared at the same times, the prayers followed their ancient sequence with the reliability of weather patterns, predictable not in the sense of being exciting, but in the sense of being trustworthy, the way the sunrise is trustworthy, the way the cold of a stone floor against bare feet in the early morning is trustworthy. The monastery's daily rhythm began before dawn, in the hour that the monks called the night office. When the first bell rang through the dormitory and the men rose from their narrow beds in the dark, pulling their habits around them against the cold, and made their way in silence down the stone stairs and along the corridor to the chapel for the first prayers of the day. There was no lamp in the corridor at that hour, and in winter there was no light of any kind, so the monks navigated by memory and by the particular feel of the stone underfoot, which changed slightly at the point where the corridor turned, from the smoother stone of the older section to the slightly rougher stone of the addition that had been built some 30 years prior. This walk in the dark, performed every morning without exception, was one of those apparently small things that accumulate over years into something that the monks would have found difficult to articulate, but would have recognized immediately as essential. A daily exercise in trust, in the willingness to move through darkness, relying entirely on what the body remembered rather than what the eyes could see. After the night office, there was a period of reading and private prayer before the next bell called them back to the chapel for the morning office, and after that the day opened into its working hours, which were occupied with the various tasks that kept the monastery functioning as a household. The work varied by season and by the particular abilities and assignments of each monk. Some tended the kitchen garden, where cabbages and leeks and several varieties of root vegetable were grown, with the serious attention that medieval monastic communities brought to anything that stood between them and hunger. Others worked in the small scriptorium, copying texts or maintaining the monastery's modest library, which occupied 2 shelves in a room that also served as the abbot's study and smelled permanently of parchment and the particular musty sweetness of old leather bindings. A few of the older monks were assigned to the infirmary, where they maintained a small stock of dried herbs and prepared the simple remedies that served the community's medical needs, mostly poultices for injuries sustained in the garden, and teas for the respiratory complaints that visited the monastery reliably every winter. Moving through the dormitory with the patient thoroughness of a houseguest who has nowhere else to be. The younger monks, newly arrived and still learning the community's particular customs, were generally assigned to the most physical work, the carrying and cleaning and maintaining that kept the building itself in the state of functional, if modest repair that a community of modest means could sustain. Meals were taken in the refectory, a long, low room with a wooden table running most of its length, and benches on either side, worn smooth by decades of use. The food was plain, organized around what the kitchen garden produced in each season, and supplemented by bread baked in the monastery's own small oven, and by whatever the community could afford to purchase from the town market, which was not a great deal in most seasons. In autumn there were root vegetables roasted with the fat from a pig, that was kept all year for this purpose. In winter there were soups made from dried beans and whatever had been preserved from the summer harvest. In spring, the first of the garden's early growth arrived on the table with a cheerfulness that the monks received with something approaching genuine delight, not because the food itself was remarkable, but because it announced the end of another winter, which in a community that lived largely without the diversions available to people in the town, was a transition of considerable significance. The summer meals were the most varied, and in some respects the most pleasant, featuring the garden at its most productive, the table decorated on feast days with wildflowers brought in from the meadow at the valley's edge by whichever monk had been assigned to walk there for the purpose. In the evenings, after the final prayers and the last bell of the day, the monastery settled into its nighttime quiet with a speed that always struck newcomers as slightly startling. The community that had been, during the working hours, a collection of individual people going about individual tasks became, in the space of perhaps 20 minutes after the evening bell, simply a building in the dark, its windows going one by one from candlelit to black, its corridors emptying, the only sounds the faint settling of old stone and the distant noise of the river, which on still nights could be heard clearly from the upper floors. This nightly transformation was one of the monastery's quiet pleasures, or so some of the older monks described it, the feeling of an entire community exhaling at once, releasing the day's accumulated small tensions into the darkness, and settling into the particular quality of rest that comes not from exhaustion but from completion, from the sense that the day's required things had been done, and that the night's required thing, which was simply to rest, could now begin. It was into this life that Anselm arrived in the autumn of his 22nd year, caring very little, knowing almost no one, and possessed of a quietness that the abbot noted on the day of his arrival and would remark upon several times in the years that followed, not as a performance or a discipline, but as something that seemed to belong to the young man's, a stillness that the monastery recognized and in some sense welcomed the way a house welcomes furniture that fits its proportions. He was assigned a bed in the dormitory's eastern row, a narrow space with a single hook on the wall for his habit, and a small wooden shelf for the few items he had brought with him. From his bed, in the morning, when the light began to come through the dormitory's high windows, he could see a thin slice of the cathedral's upper towers. It was not yet enough to draw, but it was enough, as it turned out, to begin wanting to. He came on a Thursday, in the middle of October, by which point the valley had already committed itself fully to autumn in the way that part of France tends to do, not gradually, but all at once, as if some collective decision had been made overnight, and by morning everything had agreed to change color simultaneously. The trees along the river road had gone to gold, and a deep rust orange that the low October light intensified in the late afternoon, and the air carried the particular smell of that season. Wood smoke from the town's chimneys, mixed with the smell of wet leaves and turned earth from the fields being prepared for winter. A smell that is one of the most fundamentally calming things a human nose can encounter, tied as it is to some deep and wordless memory of enclosure, of drawing inward, of the legitimate permission that autumn grants to slow down and seek warmth. Anselm had walked most of the way from the village where he had been living with his father's family, a distance of roughly 2 days on foot, carrying his belongings in a cloth bundle that contained a second habit, a pair of wool stockings, a small psalter that had belonged to his mother, and very little else. He arrived at the monastery gate in the early afternoon, when the light was already beginning its long autumn descent toward the horizon, and the gatekeeper who admitted him noted in the brief record he kept of such things that the young man was thin, that he was quiet, and that he stood for a moment in the courtyard, after the gate closed behind him, and looked up at the sky, with an expression that the gatekeeper, who had seen many arrivals over many years, described simply as someone arriving home, which was an unusual thing to write about a person who had never been there before. The abbot at that time was a man named Father Bertrand, who had been leading the community for 11 years, and had developed over those years a particular skill at reading the characters of new arrivals. A skill born less from any special intuition than from simple accumulated experience, and the patience to observe without immediately drawing conclusions. He received Anselm in his study on the afternoon of that first Thursday, offering him a seat and a cup of warm water with dried herbs steeped in it, and spent the better part of an hour asking him questions, not the formal questions of an examination, but the quieter questions of a person trying to understand what kind of person was sitting across from them. He asked about Anselm's family, about the village he had come from, about what he had been doing in the years since he had first expressed a wish to enter religious life, and the somewhat longer period that had passed before the opportunity to do so had actually presented itself. Anselm answered each question with the unhurried care of someone who had thought about these things before, but was not in the habit of saying them aloud, and Father Bertrand, listening, found that he kept noticing the same quality the gatekeeper had noted, a fundamental stillness in the young man that was not the stillness of shyness or uncertainty, but something more settled, as if the interior noise that most people carry with them everywhere had, in Anselm's case, been turned down to a level that was barely audible. Anselm was 22 years old that autumn, of medium height, with hands that were already slightly roughened from the farm work he had been doing since his middle teenage years, and a face that the few descriptions we have of him agree on as being unremarkable in its individual features, but somehow pleasant in its overall effect. The face of someone whose attention, when it settled on you, made you feel that you had been genuinely seen rather than merely looked at. He had received a basic education from the village priest, enough to read and write in Latin at a functional, if not elegant level, and he had spent several years helping with the correspondence of a minor ecclesiastical official in the nearest town, which had given him a familiarity with documents and with the particular discipline of rendering language into marks on paper that would serve him, though he did not yet know it, in ways that had nothing to do with correspondence. He was not, by his own account or anyone else's, a person of remarkable gifts. He was careful, he was attentive, he was comfortable with repetition, and he had a capacity for sitting quietly with a single thing for a long time without growing restless. In the world outside the monastery, these qualities might have passed unremarked, might even have been counted as a kind of limitation. Inside the monastery walls, they were precisely what was needed. His first weeks followed the pattern that the monastery had established for all new arrivals, a period of adjustment during which the newcomer was guided through the daily routine by an older monk, assigned for the purpose, learning not just the sequence of prayers and tasks, but the particular customs of the community, the small unwritten protocols that every long-established household develops and which are never written down. because they seem so obvious to those who already know them, and so opaque to those who do not. Anselm's guide was a monk named Brother Gerard, who had been in the community for 20 years and approached the task of orientation with the cheerful thoroughness of someone who genuinely enjoyed explaining things, walking Anselm through each part of the monastery's day with a quiet running commentary that was partly practical instruction and partly the accumulated observations of a man who had been paying attention to this particular life for 2 decades. The kitchen garden was explained in terms of what grew, where, and why. The library was explained in terms of which volumes were to be handled with extra care. The chapel was explained in terms of where each monk stood during the various offices, and how the particular acoustics of the space meant that the voices on the right side of the nave carried slightly better than those on the left, a piece of information that Anselm filed away with the same patient attention he gave to everything else. The cold was the first thing that surprised him, or rather the specific quality of the cold inside the monastery, which was different from the cold of the outdoor autumn he had walked through to arrive. It was a still cold, a cold that had been accumulating in the stone walls for years, and that released itself into the air of the corridors and dormitory with a consistency that outdoor cold, which varied with the wind and the time of day, did not have. He learned quickly to sleep in his wool stockings and to rise before the night office bell if he wanted a moment to prepare himself for the cold of the corridor before being required to walk through it. He learned that the kitchen, during the hours when the bread was baking, was the warmest room in the building, and that this warmth drifted pleasantly into the adjacent refectory in the mornings, making the first meal of the day the most comfortable in a physical sense, even though it was also the most sparsely attended, since many of the monks took their small morning portion quickly and returned to their work. He learned that the second-floor corridor on the eastern side of the building, where his own cell was located, caught a particular draft from a gap in the window frame at its far end, and that this draft could be partially mitigated by walking close to the inner wall, a piece of practical knowledge that he would use every morning for the next 47 years. And on those mornings, walking that corridor toward the window at its far end, he would pass the small room that had been assigned to him as a workspace, the room with the wooden table and the westward-facing window, the room where the light settled slowly across the floor in that particular way. He had not yet been given paper. He had not yet asked for it. But each morning, pausing for just a moment at the doorway, he found himself looking through the window at the cathedral's western facade with a quality of attention that he recognized, even then, as something other than ordinary looking. And if you're still with us now, still following the slow thread of this story through the quiet dark, then rest your eyes and let the cold of those stone corridors settle around you like something familiar, something that has always been there, steady and unhurried, the way old buildings are steady, the way the dark is steady, the way the next chapter is already waiting, patient as stone. The paper came from the scriptorium, as most things made of paper in the monastery did, and it arrived in Anselm's hands not through any formal request or special permission, but through the simple and somewhat accidental generosity of Brother Thomas, the monk who oversaw the scriptorium's small supply of materials, and who had noticed over the previous several weeks that Anselm had developed a habit of pausing near the scriptorium doorway during the free hours of the early afternoon and looking at the shelves with the expression of someone trying to decide whether to ask a question. Brother Thomas was a practical man who found indecision mildly uncomfortable to observe, and so one afternoon, in late November, approximately 6 weeks after Anselm's arrival, he simply handed the young monk 3 sheets of paper and a stick of charcoal, without waiting to be asked, saying only that the paper was from a batch whose edges had been cut unevenly and was therefore unsuitable for the careful copying work the scriptorium required, and that it would otherwise go to line the shelves against moisture, which would be a reasonable use for it, but not a particularly inspired one. Anselm accepted the paper and the charcoal with a quietness that Brother Thomas found either deeply grateful or entirely unsurprised, and carried them back to his small workspace at the end of the eastern corridor. He set the paper on the wooden table and looked at it for some time before doing anything else. This was characteristic of him, as Brother Gerard would later observe to the abbot in one of those casual conversations between monks that serve as the community's informal way of keeping track of its members. The tendency to be still with a thing before engaging with it, to give it the full weight of his attention before moving his hands toward it. The paper was a pale cream color, slightly irregular at two of its edges where the cutting had gone wrong, with a surface that was smoother in some areas than others. The inconsistency of handmade materials that had been produced quickly rather than carefully. He ran his fingers across it once, feeling the texture, which was something between rough linen and the inner surface of a dried leaf. And then he set it flat on the table and looked out the window at what he had been looking at every morning since his arrival. The western facade of the cathedral rising against a sky that on that particular late November afternoon was the color of old pewter, flat and even, and without drama, the kind of sky that makes everything beneath it appear more solid and more itself, the stone of the facade taking on in that light a quality of particular density, as if the absence of shadow had allowed the stone to simply be stone, without embellishment or effect. He picked up the charcoal. It was a piece roughly the length of his index finger, slightly flattened on one side, where it had been pressed against something during its making, and it left a mark on the paper that was darker than he had expected, a deep soft black that spread very slightly at the edges of each stroke, in a way that suggested both precision and its limits simultaneously. He began with the roof line of the left tower, which was the highest point of the facade and therefore the natural place to establish the scale of everything that would follow. Drawing a line that was not quite straight, but was close enough to straight that the slight irregularity read, not as error, but as the natural variation of a hand attempting to follow something it was seeing, rather than something it was imagining. The line went from the upper left corner of the paper toward the center, stopping where the tower's roofline met the junction between the tower and the upper section of the facade proper. And then he paused and looked up, and looked back down, and drew the corresponding line on the right side, which was not quite symmetrical with the first because the cathedral itself was not quite symmetrical. The right tower having been completed some years after the left, and built by different hands, working from a plan that was similar but not identical to the original. The upper portions of the facade were easier than the lower ones, in the sense that they were primarily geometric shapes, the towers resolving into their final forms through a series of architectural decisions that expressed themselves visually as a progression from the rectangular mass of the lower tower, through the slightly narrowed middle section, to the pyramidal stone cap at the very top. Anselm drew these shapes with the careful attention of someone who was working from observation, rather than from any understanding of why the shapes were the way they were, recording what he saw without yet having the vocabulary to analyze it, which turned out to be an advantage rather than a limitation, since it meant that his eye went to the actual stone rather than to his idea of what the stone should look like. And the actual stone had a complexity of surface and a subtlety of proportion that any preconception would have smoothed away. The central section of the facade, between the two towers, was where the main entrance was located, the great portal with its carved figures arranged in concentric arches above the double doors. And this was considerably more difficult, since the figures were small at this distance, and the carving created a play of light and shadow that changed as the light outside shifted, so that what he was drawing was not a fixed thing, but something in slow continuous motion, the shadows deepening and retreating as clouds moved across the pewter sky. He worked for perhaps 2 hours, though he did not count the time and would not have been able to say afterward exactly how long it had taken. The room grew gradually colder as the afternoon progressed toward evening, and the light through the window changed from the flat gray of mid-afternoon to the slightly warmer, more directional light of the late afternoon, which came from lower in the sky and caught the upper portions of the cathedral's towers in a way that the mid-afternoon light had not, creating a faint suggestion of warmth along their western faces that Anselm tried to capture by pressing the charcoal more lightly, letting the paper show through in thin, pale lines within the darker tone of the stone. When the bell rang for the evening office, he set down the charcoal and looked at what he had made. It was not a skilled drawing in any technical sense, lacking the precision of line and understanding of proportion that would come only with practice. But it was recognizably the cathedral, recognizably that facade, That particular arrangement of towers and portal and the three tall windows above the central doorway whose stone tracery he had attempted and largely failed to render at this scale. He looked at the drawing for a long moment. Then he looked out the window at the facade itself, and back at the drawing. And the comparison was not discouraging so much as clarifying, showing him the distance between what he had seen and what he had managed to set down. A distance that felt less like failure than like an invitation. He left the drawing on the table when he went to the evening office, setting the charcoal beside it and placing one of the two remaining blank sheets of paper gently on top of it to keep the charcoal dust from smearing in the night air. And if your eyes are resting now, if the words are arriving more slowly and settling more softly than they did at the beginning of this evening, that is the right pace for what comes next. Because what comes next is not one drawing but many, not one morning but thousands, and all of them deserve the same unhurried attention that Anselm himself brought to the window each day, patient and steady, as the candle burns low and the room grows still. There is no single moment at which a habit becomes a devotion. The transformation happens somewhere in the accumulated middle of things, in the long, unremarkable stretch between the first time and the last time. And it happens so gradually that the person at the center of it is usually the last to notice, if they notice at all. By the end of his first year in the monastery, Anselm had drawn the cathedral's western facade perhaps 60 times, which meant he had drawn it more days than not, and had accumulated a small stack of paper on the corner of his table that Father Bertrand had noticed during a routine visit to the cells, and remarked upon with the mild curiosity of a man who found the activity neither alarming nor particularly surprising, since monks had always found their own ways of ordering their inner lives, and drawing was, from the abbot's point of view, considerably less troubling than some alternatives. By the end of the second year, the stack had grown and been tied with a length of cord and placed on the shelf above the table, where it sat beside the psalter that had belonged to Anselm's mother, and a small smooth stone he had picked up from the river road on the day he arrived, a gray stone of no particular distinction that he had carried in his pocket for the entire walk, and had set on the shelf on his first evening as if marking the spot where his life in this place had begun. The second year was different from the first in ways that Anselm himself would have found difficult to articulate, but that showed clearly in the drawings if you set them side by side and looked at them in sequence. The first year's drawings had the quality of careful attempts, each one an effort to get something right, to close the distance between the facade as it existed in stone and the facade as it existed on paper, and you could see in them the particular tension of that effort, lines that had been hesitated over, proportions that had been corrected midway, and left with the faint ghost of the first attempt still visible beneath. The second year's drawings were quieter, not more skilled exactly, though the hand had certainly become more practiced, but quieter in a different sense, the sense that the person making them had stopped trying to capture the facade and had begun instead simply to spend time with it, the way you spend time with something you have decided to know rather than something you are trying to master. The lines came more easily, not because they were less careful, but because the care had moved from the surface to somewhere deeper, from the hand to something behind the hand. The years that followed arranged themselves around the drawings the way the monastery's days arranged themselves around the bells, not constrained by them exactly, but given their shape by them, the rhythm of the drawing practice providing a kind of internal structure that ran parallel to and intertwined with the monastery's external structure of prayer and work and sleep. Autumn came each year, with its same smell of wood smoke and wet leaves, and the light through the window turned the particular gold of October, and Anselm sat at his table and drew the towers in that gold light as he had drawn them the year before, and the year before that, each drawing slightly different from the last because the light was never precisely the same light, the sky was never precisely the same sky, and his own eye was never precisely the same eye, having accumulated in the intervening year another 12 months of looking at this particular thing, and being changed in small ways by that looking, the way all sustained attention changes the one who attends. The winters brought a different quality of light, flatter and grayer, and in the drawings from the winter months the facade appeared more austere, the shadows less pronounced, the stone carrying less warmth in its color and more of the monumental solidity that cold light tends to reveal in large stone structures. The spring drawings had a freshness that the winter drawings lacked, a brightness in the sky behind the towers that Anselm rendered by pressing more lightly with the charcoal and allowing the paper's natural color to carry the upper portion of each composition. In the 10th year, a fire in the scriptorium destroyed a portion of the monastery's paper supply, and for approximately 3 months, Anselm drew on whatever he could find, including the blank end pages of 2 damaged volumes that Brother Thomas salvaged from the fire's edges and deemed beyond repair as readable texts. These drawings on book page have a different character from the others, constrained by their irregular shapes and smaller dimensions. The cathedral's facade compressed into spaces that required Anselm to make decisions about what to include and what to leave out. Decisions he did not have to make on a full sheet of paper where everything could be accommodated. Some of these compressed drawings have a concentrated quality, an intensity of observation in the details that were chosen for inclusion, that the larger drawings do not always achieve, as if the limitation of space had forced a clarity that abundance of paper had occasionally allowed him to avoid. When the scriptorium supply was replenished, and full sheets became available again, Anselm returned to them without apparent hesitation, and the drawings resumed their customary scale. But something from those 3 months of compression persisted, a slightly sharper attention to the specific over the general, a willingness to let certain parts of the facade receive more care than others rather than attempting each time to render the whole with equal thoroughness. The monastery itself changed around him across the decades, in the slow incremental way that institutions change when they are functioning well, which is to say barely noticeably from one year to the next, but considerably when measured across longer spans. Monks arrived and settled, and grew old, and died. The kitchen garden was expanded in the 18th year, and then contracted again in the 23rd, when a succession of wet summers made the lower beds unworkable. The chapel received a new set of choir stalls in the 26th year, carved by a craftsman from the town whose work was admired by everyone, and who spent 3 months in the monastery completing the commission, eating at the long table in the refectory, and occupying a guest cell at the end of the western corridor. The roof of the dormitory was repaired twice, once in the 15th year and once in the 31st, each time by a team of workers who arrived in spring and departed in summer and left behind them a smell of fresh timber that gradually faded over the following months until the dormitory smelled again of old stone and beeswax and the particular accumulated scent of many years of human occupation. Through all of it, the drawing continued, morning after morning, season after season, the charcoal moving across the paper in Anselm's increasingly familiar hand, the cathedral receiving each day his full and unhurried attention. And if your eyes are heavy now, if the decades are passing softly and without urgency in the darkness behind your closed lids, then rest in that. Because that is precisely what 47 years of quiet mornings feels like from the inside. Not a long time, but a deepening. Not a distance, but a settling. The way a stone settles into the earth it rests on, slowly and without resistance, until it becomes difficult to say where the stone ends and the ground begins. The candle on the table is low and steady. The room is quiet and still. Outside the window, the cathedral stands in whatever light this particular morning has chosen to offer, patient as it has always been, waiting as it will continue to wait. While inside the room a man touches charcoal to paper and begins once more to draw. Rain changed the cathedral entirely, and not in the way that rain changes most things, by making them darker or more uniform or simply wet. Rain changed the cathedral by revealing qualities of its stone that dry weather kept hidden, drawing out from the pale limestone a deeper range of tone, a complexity of gray and silver, and the particular dark cream of saturated stone, so that a facade that in dry morning light appeared to be one surface revealed itself in rain to be many surfaces, each responding to the water differently, depending on its age, its texture, its orientation, and the degree to which the centuries had worn, or smoothed, or roughened it. Anselm drew the cathedral in rain many times across his 47 years, and these drawings have a character that distinguishes them immediately from the dry weather drawings, not because he used a different technique, but because the subject itself had changed. The rain transforming the facade into something that required different decisions from the hand holding the charcoal, different choices about where to press harder and where to lift away, where to let the paper carry the light and where to let the charcoal carry the dark. The rain drawings tend toward more contrast, more drama in the relationship between light and shadow, not because Anselm sought drama, but because the rain created it. The wet stone holding shadow more deeply, and releasing light more sharply than dry stone ever did. The sound of rain on the monastery was itself a kind of presence, entering the building through every small gap and irregularity in the old stone, and creating a background of white sound that varied in intensity with the rainfall, but never fully disappeared once it had begun. From the first tentative drops on the dormitory roof in the hours before a storm, to the full sustained percussion of heavy rain against the western wall, which faced into the prevailing weather and took the brunt of every serious storm that moved through the valley from that direction. Anselm's workspace, being on the eastern side of the building, was somewhat protected from the worst of the rain noise, but on heavy days the sound found its way around the building's bulk and arrived at his window as a softer version of what the western wall was experiencing, a muffled continuous murmur that mixed with the smell of wet stone coming through the window's small gap at the top. A smell so specific and so reliably associated with the act of drawing that in later years he would find himself reaching for the charcoal whenever rain began, as if the smell itself had become an instruction. There was a particular kind of autumn rain that arrived in the valley in the weeks between the end of harvest and the first cold of approaching winter, a rain that was not heavy but persistent, lasting sometimes for 3 or 4 days without pause, the sky settling to a uniform pale gray that made it impossible to tell where clouds ended and sky began, the whole upper portion of the world becoming a single featureless surface from which water descended in fine, slow curtains, rather than distinct drops. In this rain, the cathedral's towers disappeared into the gray at their upper portions, the stone caps that were the tower's highest points becoming indistinguishable from the sky behind them, so that the towers appeared to have no top, to simply continue upward into the gray indefinitely, which gave them a quality of height that their actual measurements did not quite justify. Anselm drew this effect several times, the towers fading at their summits into paper left unmarked, the charcoal simply stopping before it reached the upper edge of the composition, allowing the whiteness of the paper to stand in for the whiteness of the rain sky, an economy of means that produced one of the more quietly beautiful effects in the entire collection. Spring rain was different from autumn rain the way spring is different from autumn, which is to say it carried more light despite the moisture, the sky behind the water being a brighter gray, almost a silver, and the intervals between showers bringing a clarity to the air that made the cathedral's stone appear freshly cut, as if the rain had washed away not just the accumulated dust of winter, but some layer of time itself, leaving the facade briefly in the state it had occupied when it was new, the limestone pale and sharp-edged and faintly luminous in the way of things that have been cleaned and not yet had the chance to settle back into their usual weathered selves. In the spring rain drawings, the charcoal lines are often lighter, the overall tone of each drawing higher and more open, and there are sometimes drawings from this period in which the sky above the towers has been rendered with such a careful gradation, from dark at the top to almost nothing at the horizon line, that the towers appear to be standing, not under a cloudy sky but under a sky of particular luminous depth, as if the rain had turned the air itself into something worth looking at. Winter rain was the hardest weather to draw in, not because of anything the rain did to the cathedral, but because of what it did to the room. The cold that the monastery contained in its stone walls became in winter rain an active cold, rather than a passive one. The damp air, finding every gap in the window frame and arriving at the table as a thin continuous draft that made Anselm's hands slow, and the charcoal difficult to control with the precision he had developed across years of dry weather practice. Some of the winter rain drawings showed this difficulty, the lines slightly less certain than usual, the proportions occasionally drifting in ways that the summer drawings did not permit. And there is a quality in these imprecise drawings that is in its own way valuable, a record of the physical conditions under which the work was done, a kind of honesty about the limits of the body that the more accomplished drawings, made in comfortable autumn light, with warm hands and clear air, did not need to acknowledge. Anselm did not discard these drawings. He added them to the stack with the same equanimity he brought to everything, as if accuracy in the drawing was always secondary to the act of drawing itself. The presence at the window, the attention given, the morning spent in the company of the stone. There were also days of rain, when he did not draw, when the weather was severe enough, or the light poor enough, that the facade was truly invisible. The rain coming so heavily that the space between the monastery window and the cathedral wall became a moving curtain of water through which nothing could be seen. On these days, Anselm sat at the table anyway, his hands resting on the paper, the charcoal set beside it, and looked at what the rain had replaced the cathedral with, which was something like pure sound and pure movement. The world dissolved into its weather. The stone temporarily returned to the elements that had always surrounded it. He did not draw these days, but he did not leave the table either, remaining through the worst of the storm as if keeping a kind of company with the place where the drawing usually happened. The faithful attendance of someone who understands that the work is not only in the doing, but also in the waiting, in the willingness to be present even when the thing you have come to see has, for the moment, chosen not to be seen. And if the sound of rain is with you now, somewhere in the distance of wherever you are resting tonight, let it carry you the way all rain carries everything, gently and without asking, toward the quiet dark where the story waits. A monastery is not an island, though it sometimes feels like one from the inside, and the community that Anselm lived within for 47 years was in continuous, if quiet, contact with the world beyond its walls, receiving new members and releasing old ones, hosting travelers and pilgrims, conducting business with the town's merchants, and maintaining the complex web of relationships with neighboring estates and ecclesiastical authorities that medieval religious communities required simply to continue existing. People moved through the monastery the way water moves through stone, slowly and without drama, leaving traces that were sometimes visible and sometimes not. And Anselm, whose particular quality of attention meant that he noticed things that others overlooked, accumulated across his decades there a detailed and largely unspoken knowledge of the people who had briefly shared his world before moving on to whatever came next in their own stories. Some of them he knew well. Others he knew only as presences, as the sound of an unfamiliar voice in the refectory or the sight of a face at the chapel door that was there for a few weeks, and then was not. All of them, in their different ways, were part of the texture of the life in which the drawings were made, the human weather that surrounded the quiet center of his morning practice the way the valley's actual weather surrounded the cathedral's stone. Father Bertrand, the abbot who had received Anselm on his first Thursday afternoon, led the community for 23 years before the decline of his health made the role impossible to continue, and he retired to a smaller cell at the quieter end of the monastery, where he lived for 4 more years in a state of comfortable diminishment, his body reducing its claims on the world in the measured way of someone who had made their peace with reduction. He had been a man of moderate temperament and considerable patience, as has been noted, but he had also been possessed of a dry and understated humor that emerged most reliably in the hours after the evening meal, when the community sat together in the most relaxed portion of the day's structure, and conversation was permitted to wander. Anselm had been present for many of these evenings, sitting quietly at his usual place near the end of the bench while Father Bertrand's observations moved gently around the table. And he had valued them in the particular way that quiet people value the wit of others, which is to say, intensely, and without always finding the means to say so. When the old abbot died in the 41st year of the century, in a February so cold that the ground was too hard for burial, and the community had to wait 3 weeks before the grave could be dug, Anselm drew the cathedral's facade that morning as he had drawn it every other morning, and set the drawing on its stack, and went about the rest of the day, and the drawings from that week are indistinguishable from the drawings of any other week, which is perhaps its own kind of tribute. Brother Gerard, who had guided Anselm through his first weeks with such cheerful thoroughness, remained in the community for 31 years before his health failed, and he was moved to the infirmary, where he proved to be an extremely communicative patient, offering detailed accounts of his symptoms to anyone who came within conversational range, and expressing strong opinions about the remedies being applied to them. He had been, across those 31 years, one of the monastery's most reliably cheerful presences, a man who appeared to find genuine contentment in the daily work of the community, and who brought to even the most tedious tasks a quality of engagement that made them seem, if not exciting, then at least worthwhile. Anselm had been fond of him in a way that exceeded what simple proximity might have produced, the way you become fond of someone who was kind to you when you were new and uncertain, whose kindness established a kind of debt that you never quite repay and never quite forget. When Gerard died, Anselm was among those who sat with him in the infirmary through the final night, and he noted afterward, in the brief written record he occasionally kept of significant events, that Brother Gerard had spent the last hours of his life in what appeared to be a state of complete contentment, his breathing slow and regular, his face carrying the particular expression of someone in the middle of a pleasant thought. There were others who stayed shorter times and left lighter traces. A novice named Philippe arrived in the summer of Anselm's 19th year in the monastery, a young man of 16 from a prosperous family in a town 2 days to the north, who had been sent to the monastery by parents who hoped the life would settle him, and who discovered within approximately 6 months that it would not, that the silence and repetition which suited Anselm so completely were for Philippe a form of ongoing mild torment, his requiring more motion and more noise, and more variety than the monastery's routine could provide. He left on a morning in late winter, departing with the same polite quietness with which he had arrived, and Anselm, who had spoken to him only occasionally but had observed him often, noted his departure with something that was not quite sadness, and not quite relief, but something of both. The recognition that the monastery, like any place, was not equally suited to everyone who entered it, and that this was not a failure on either side, but simply a fact about the particular shapes that different lives require. The stonemason came in the 28th year of Anselm's time in the monastery, a man named Clement, who had been contracted to repair a section of the south tower's exterior wall, where a crack had appeared, and been growing slowly wider for the better part of a decade. Clement was a large and deliberate man in his middle 40s, with hands that appeared to have been made for the specific purpose of working with stone, broad and slightly flattened at the tips of the fingers in the way of people who spend their working lives pressing their hands against hard surfaces. He stayed for 6 weeks, eating at the long table in the refectory, with a focused efficiency that suggested he regarded meals primarily as fuel, and spending his working hours on the scaffolding that had been erected against the south tower's damaged section, chipping away the compromised stone and replacing it with new blocks, cut from a quarry 2 days to the east. Anselm observed him from a distance on several occasions, watching the way the mason read the wall's surface before beginning any work, running his hands across the stone in a gesture that Anselm recognized with something like kinship, the gesture of someone paying sustained attention to the particular qualities of a specific surface, trying to understand it on its own terms before doing anything to it. Before leaving, Clement scratched his name and the year into a small section of the new stonework, just above the repaired section, where it would be visible only from the scaffolding itself and therefore invisible to almost everyone else. A private mark in a public structure, the kind of signature that knows it will outlast the person who made it and asks nothing in return for that permanence. These people, and the many others whose names and faces Anselm held in the long memory of his quiet life, were not incidental to the drawings. They were part of the same sustained act of attention, the same morning-by-morning insistence that the thing in front of him deserved to be looked at carefully and without hurry, whether it was stone or sky or the face of a man who was kind to him in his first uncertain weeks, or the hands of a mason who read walls the way some people read faces. And if the faces of people from your own life are drifting through the soft dark behind your eyes now, people who passed through and left their particular traces, then let them come, because that is what this hour is for, the gentle inventory of all the lives that have briefly occupied the same world as yours, patient and unhurried, the candle low, the room still, the story continuing its slow and quiet work. Paper, in the monastery of Anselm's time, was not the thing we think of when we think of paper now. It was heavier and more variable, made by hand in small batches from linen rags that had been soaked and beaten and pressed through a process that left the finished sheets with a texture and a character that reflected the particular conditions of their making, so that no two batches were precisely alike, and a careful hand could feel the difference between paper from one season's production and paper from another's, the way a careful nose can distinguish between wines made from the same grape in different years. The monastery obtained its paper from a supplier in the nearest town, a man who dealt in the various materials that the religious community required for its correspondence and record-keeping, and the quality of what arrived each season depended partly on what the supplier had available, and partly on what the monastery could afford to pay, which varied considerably from one year to the next depending on the harvest and the various obligations that consumed the community's modest income. In lean years, the paper was rougher and more uneven, sheets that had been made quickly from inferior materials, and in better years, it was smoother and more consistent, with a surface that took the charcoal more evenly and held it more reliably against the shifting of air in the room. Anselm became, over decades of daily use, a person of considerable knowledge regarding paper, in the way that anyone who works closely with a material for long enough becomes knowledgeable about it not through formal study but through the accumulated intimacy of handling. He knew by touch which sheets would take a fine line and which would bleed the charcoal into their fibers, and produce only soft, indistinct marks regardless of how the hand moved. He knew which papers yellowed quickly in the damp of the winter months, and which held their color across years of storage in the wooden chest beneath his table, where the finished drawings accumulated in their growing stacks. He developed preferences, some of which he was aware of, and some of which expressed themselves only in his choices, the way he would reach for certain sheets from the new batch before others, the way he set aside the smoothest paper for the drawings he made in the particular quality of spring light that he valued most highly, as if the best light deserved the best surface, the two qualities meeting in the drawing the way good ingredients meet in a well-made thing. In a life otherwise defined by the deliberate renunciation of preference and the cultivation of equanimity toward all things equally, this quiet partiality toward particular papers was perhaps his most private indulgence, noticed by no one, accountable to no one, small enough to occupy almost no space in the moral accounting of a monastic life, but present nonetheless, a reminder that the person making the drawings was a person and not only a monk. The charcoal came from the monastery's own small supply of wood, prepared by one of the older monks who had learned the process in a previous community, and continued it here with the same undemonstrative competence he brought to everything he did. The preparation involved burning thin sticks of willow in a sealed clay pot over a slow fire, a process that drove off the wood's moisture and volatile compounds, and left behind the pure carbon structure of the original material, in a form that was fragile and light and capable, when pressed against paper, of leaving a mark that was simultaneously precise and soft, capable of great delicacy and also of rich dark density depending on the pressure applied and the angle at which the stick met the surface. The willow for this process was cut from the trees along the river, which provided a reliable annual supply of the thin, straight growth that made the best charcoal, and the cutting and the burning and the careful storage of the finished sticks in a dry wooden box was a process that proceeded each year without particular ceremony or acknowledgement, one of the many small productive activities that kept the monastery functioning as a self-sufficient household. Anselm went through a great deal of charcoal across 47 years, enough that the monk responsible for its preparation eventually came to think of a portion of each batch as being specifically for Anselm's use, setting it aside without being asked in the same way that certain vegetables from the garden were set aside for the infirmary's medicinal needs, as a matter of practical acknowledgement that this particular resource served this particular purpose in this particular life. The charcoal sticks wore down as he used them, becoming shorter and then shorter still until they were too small to hold comfortably between the fingers, at which point Anselm used them in a different way, holding the tiny remnant flat against the paper and using its side rather than its tip, producing broader, softer marks that he used for the sky portions of his drawings, and for the large flat surfaces of the facade's lower walls, where the stone had been laid in courses that were more regular than the upper portions, and required less precision to render. Nothing was wasted. The smallest fragments, too small even for this use, were ground between two stones into a fine powder that he mixed with a little water to produce a wash. A thin gray liquid that could be applied with a folded piece of cloth to create the large tonal areas of his sky backgrounds. The overall gray of an overcast day rendered not in charcoal lines, but in this whispered suggestion of tone that dried to something barely darker than the paper itself. The smell of the workspace was something that Anselm had long since stopped noticing consciously, but that was noticed by others who entered the room. A smell that was composed in roughly equal parts of old paper, charcoal dust, cold stone, and the particular woody dryness of a room that contained a great deal of stored material and received only limited ventilation. Brother Thomas, who occasionally came to deliver new paper or to discuss the scriptorium's requirements, described the room's smell once as similar to the smell of the scriptorium itself, but older, as if the drawings had been accumulating their own history in the air of the space, and the smell of that history had become part of the room's permanent character. This was not an inaccurate description. The drawings did accumulate their history in the room, the earliest ones at the bottom of the chest acquiring over decades of faint browning at their edges, a slight brittleness in the paper's fibers, a deepening of the yellowing that all paper undergoes with time, while the newer ones on top retained their relative freshness, the charcoal still dark and the paper still pale. The whole collection forming a kind of geological record of time measured not in stone strata, but in paper. The oldest layers deepest and most changed, the newest at the surface and still close to what they had been when they were made. And in that smell, in the particular mixture of old paper and charcoal and cold stone that had settled into every surface of the small room, over 4.5 decades, there was something that was in the end indistinguishable from the smell of the practice itself, from the smell of a life spent in daily attendance at a single window, a life whose physical residue was this chest of drawings, and this faint permanent perfume of attention. Rest now, if you are ready to rest. The smell of old paper is one of the most soothing things the world contains, carrying as it does the accumulated quiet of all the reading and writing and drawing that has ever been done in still rooms by lamplight, all the patient mornings and the unhurried afternoons, all the hours given willingly to the making of marks that would outlast the hands that made them. Let it settle around you like the darkness settles, evenly and without weight, and let the story continue its quiet work in whatever part of you is still listening. Nearly 4 centuries passed between the morning Anselm set down his charcoal for the last time and the November afternoon, when a woman named Marguerite, employed by the regional ecclesiastical archive to catalogue the contents of the monastery's storage rooms, pressed her palm against the surface of a wooden chest and felt beneath her hand the particular solidity of something that had been undisturbed for a very long time. 4 centuries is a span of time that resists imagination, in the way that very large numbers resist imagination, which is to say that the mind acknowledges it without truly feeling it, the way you can know the distance to a very far mountain without feeling in your body what it would mean to walk there. In those 4 centuries, the monastery had continued to function, had weathered reformations and suppressions and revivals, and the slow administrative reorganizations that ecclesiastical institutions undergo across long spans of time, had been partially rebuilt after a fire in the 17th century, damaged its western wing, had served at different periods as a working religious community, as a residence for a succession of increasingly eccentric abbot administrators, and most recently as a repository for the accumulated documents and objects that the regional church had nowhere better to store. The chest containing Anselm's drawings had moved twice in those centuries, once when the room in which he had worked was repurposed, and once during the reconstruction after the fire, and on each occasion it had been moved without being opened, its contents unknown to the people who carried it, just another heavy wooden box in a building full of heavy wooden boxes, its significance invisible from the outside. Marguerite had been working through the monastery's storage rooms for 11 days, when she came to the room at the end of the eastern corridor on the 2nd floor, a room that appeared on the building's administrative records as a former workspace of uncertain purpose, last occupied as a storage space, sometime in the early 18th century according to the sparse notations in the inventory she had been given. She had developed, across those 11 days, a working method suited to rooms of this kind, beginning at the door and moving methodically inward, cataloging each object before moving to the next, taking notes in the small leather-bound book she carried, and occasionally making quick sketches of items that seemed to require visual description. She was a careful and patient worker, qualities she had developed not through any particular effort of self-discipline, but because she had discovered early in her professional life that careful and patient work in archives almost always produced more interesting results than hurried work. That the things worth finding in old buildings were rarely the things that announced themselves from across the room, but were more often the things that revealed themselves only to someone willing to spend enough time in their presence. She was in her late 30s, of medium height, with the slightly rounded shoulders of someone who spends most of their working hours leaning over tables. And she had the archivist's characteristic combination of genuine curiosity about the past and genuine patience with the present, the ability to spend a long afternoon in a cold, dusty room without feeling that she would rather be somewhere else. The chest was against the eastern wall, partially obscured by two other boxes that had been stacked in front of it at some point in the building's long history of casual storage. She moved the boxes aside, setting them to the left of the chest with the same methodical care she brought to everything, and stood for a moment looking at what she had uncovered. The chest was made of oak, approximately the dimensions of a traveling trunk, but lower and wider, with iron fittings at the corners that had rusted to a deep reddish brown over the centuries, and a latch mechanism of a type that she recognized from other objects of similar age as being consistent with the 15th century, though the chest could have been made slightly earlier or later, without her being able to say so definitively from the hardware alone. The wood itself was darker on the surface than oak usually became with age, which suggested it had been in a room with at some point more moisture than the current space contained, or had simply been subjected across its long life to the full range of conditions that an old stone building could offer. She photographed it with the small camera she carried, noted its dimensions and approximate age in her book, and then knelt in front of it and examined the latch. The latch was not locked, or rather whatever lock it had once possessed had long since ceased to function, the mechanism frozen in a state that was neither fully latched nor fully open but somewhere between the two. And she worked it gently with the small tool she carried for such purposes, applying careful pressure at the point where she could see the mechanism was binding, until after several minutes of patient attention, it released with a sound that was less a click than a soft exhalation, as if the chest had been holding its breath for a very long time and had now, finding itself in the presence of someone patient enough to wait, decided to breathe out. She opened the lid slowly, supporting it as it rose against the slight resistance of the hinges, which had stiffened with age but had not seized completely, and held it at its fullest extent before allowing it to rest against the wall behind the chest. The smell that came up was the smell she would later describe to her colleague as the most concentrated version of old paper she had ever encountered. Not unpleasant, nothing like decay, but dense and specific and somehow communicative. The smell of a very large quantity of paper that had been in a sealed space for a very long time, and had arrived at a kind of equilibrium with itself. A settled, dusty sweetness that suggested great age and also, strangely, a kind of preservation, as if the sealing of the chest had protected its contents from the fluctuations of the outside air, rather than subjecting them to a slow deterioration. Inside the chest, arranged in what had once been orderly stacks, but had over the centuries compressed into something more like geological layers, were the drawings. She did not know immediately what she was looking at. She lifted the first sheet carefully, using both hands and keeping it flat, and held it in the pale November light that came through the room's single window, the same window, though she did not yet know this, through which Anselm had looked out at the cathedral's western facade every morning for 47 years. The drawing on the sheet was a charcoal rendering of a cathedral facade, executed with a care and a patience that were immediately legible even to someone with no particular expertise in historical draftsmanship, the lines confident without being mechanical, the proportions carefully observed, the whole image carrying the quality of something made by a person who had looked very attentively at the thing they were drawing, and had found in that looking something worth the time it required. She set it gently on top of the chest's lid and lifted the second sheet. It was the same facade. She lifted a third. The same facade again, from the same position, in a slightly different quality of light. She stood in the cold room for a long time, lifting sheet after sheet, each one the same cathedral, each one slightly different from all the others, the drawings accumulating around her on the floor in careful piles as the November afternoon light moved slowly across the room. And the silence in the old building was complete, and the chest gave up its centuries of held breath into the still air, and the story that had been waiting in the dark for nearly 400 years began, quietly and without announcement, to be understood. Marguerite spent 3 days in the room before she moved anything to the archive's examination table. 3 days of careful preliminary work that consisted primarily of looking, of handling the drawings one by one in their original order, and allowing the sequence to speak before she imposed any interpretation upon it. This was her standard approach with newly discovered collections, born from the experience of having once, early in her career, drawn conclusions too quickly about the significance of a group of documents and having later found those conclusions substantially revised by details she had overlooked in her initial enthusiasm. Patience in the first encounter, she had since decided, was the only reliable way to ensure that what you eventually said about a thing was something the thing had actually told you, rather than something you had told yourself, while pretending to listen. So she sat with the drawings across those 3 days, in the cold room with its single window, lifting and examining and replacing each sheet in sequence, building in her mind a picture of the collection as a whole, before beginning to attend to any of its particular parts. She counted the drawings on the second day, and arrived at a total that she wrote in her notebook, and then looked at for a long moment before turning the page, a number large enough that it required her to reconsider what she thought she understood about the person who had made them and the life in which they had been made. The drawings were not dated individually, which was the first difficulty she encountered when she began the more systematic examination that followed her initial survey. There was no notation on any sheet, no name, no number, no marginal inscription of any kind, only the drawings themselves, each one the same western facade, the same two towers, the same great portal, rendered in charcoal with varying degrees of clarity and completion across what was evidently a very long period of time. The sequence of the drawings within the chest was her best available guide to their order, and she worked on the assumption that the compression of the layers over centuries had not significantly disturbed the original arrangement, that the drawing on the bottom of each stack was earlier than the drawing above it, and that the stacks themselves had originally been placed in the chest in a sequence that corresponded to their chronological order of making. This was a reasonable assumption, and it proved, in the end, to be broadly correct, though she would not know this with certainty until she had cross-referenced the drawings with other sources that would come later in her investigation. What she noticed first, working through the sequence from what she believed to be the earliest drawings to the most recent, was the change in the hand itself, the progressive refinement of the draftsmanship across time. The way the lines in the earliest drawings carried a quality of careful effort that gradually, across dozens and then hundreds of sheets, resolved into something that was not easier, but deeper. A facility born not from relaxation, but from the accumulation of so many observations of the same subject that the hand had in some sense learned to see for itself, to find its way across the familiar surfaces of the facade without the deliberate mediation of conscious decision-making. This progression was interesting in itself, a visible record of a skill developing across the entire span of a working life. But it was not what stopped her on the morning of the fourth day, and held her still in her chair for a long time with two drawings held side by side in the pale winter light. What stopped her was something else, something she had been seeing without quite registering since she first opened the chest, and that finally resolved into conscious recognition when she happened to place a drawing from what she estimated to be the collection's early period beside a drawing from what she estimated to be its final years. The cathedral had changed, not dramatically, not in any way that would have been visible to a person who saw the building only at intervals of years or decades, but perceptibly, unmistakably, across the long span of the drawing sequence. A crack that did not exist in the early drawings appeared in the middle period, as a thin line in the stone of the right tower's lower section, a line so fine in its first appearance that she had to hold the drawing at an angle to the light to be certain it was there, and then grew drawing by drawing, with the painful slowness of all structural deterioration, until in the later drawings it was clearly visible even at the scale at which the drawings rendered it, a dark seam in the pale stone that anyone familiar with the building's structural vulnerabilities would have recognized immediately as the kind of crack that requires attention. The crack had been repaired. She could see that in the drawings from what appeared to be the collection's middle decades, the line disappearing across a sequence of perhaps 20 sheets before the stone in that area appeared slightly different in tone and texture from the surrounding material, the characteristic signature of new stone mortared into an old wall. The repair visible to Anselm's careful eye even from the distance of his window, and rendered by him with the same patient fidelity he brought to everything he saw. There were other changes, each one quiet and specific, and visible only because the same eye had been attending to the same surface for long enough to notice what shifted against the background of what stayed the same. A window in the upper section of the facade's central portion, between the two towers, underwent what appeared to be a modification to its stone tracery sometime in the collection's middle period. The pattern of the tracery in the later drawings differing subtly but consistently from the pattern in the earlier ones. The change too systematic to be a variation in rendering and too consistent across subsequent drawings to be anything other than a physical alteration to the stone itself. One of the decorative figures carved into the portal's outermost arch disappeared from the drawings across a sequence that suggested its removal or deterioration had occurred gradually. The figure present and reasonably detailed in the earlier drawings, then less distinct, then represented by what appeared to be an absence of shadow where shadow had previously been, and finally simply gone. The stone in that position smooth and undifferentiated where the carved form had once given it depth and specificity. None of these changes had been recorded in any document that Marguerite had yet encountered in her work through the monastery's archive. They existed only in the drawings, captured not because Anselm had intended to record them, but because his attention had been thorough enough and sustained enough that the record had made itself, accumulating in the margins of his daily practice, the way important things so often accumulate, without announcement, without agenda, simply as the natural consequence of paying close attention to the same thing for a very long time. She sat in the cold room on that fourth afternoon, with the two drawings in her hands, the early one and the late one, and looked from one to the other and back again. And the sensation she experienced was not the sharp excitement of discovery, which is how such moments are often described, but something quieter than that, something closer to the feeling of being trusted with a confidence, of having a long silence finally broken not with urgency, but with the simple, unhurried willingness of something that had been waiting to be understood and had found, at last, someone patient enough to listen. And if you are resting now, if the drawings are spreading themselves across the quiet dark behind your eyes, each one the same facade in different light, then you are in precisely the right place, because the story is settling toward its resolution, the way all things settle in the deep hours of the night, slowly and without resistance, the candle burning steadily, the room holding its familiar cold, the cathedral standing in its valley as it has always stood, patient and unchanged and full of the small changes that only the most devoted attention will ever find. The valley in which the cathedral stood had been inhabited for longer than anyone in Anselm's time could have known. Its particular combination of a reliable river, sheltered slopes on three sides, and soil that rewarded cultivation with reasonable consistency, making it one of those places that human beings have returned to across millennia, with the reliable instinct of creatures who recognize a good location when they find one. By the time the cathedral's foundations were laid in the 1200s, the valley had already accumulated several centuries of continuous habitation, and the town that arranged itself around the cathedral's base was itself built, partly on the foundations of earlier structures, the way medieval towns so often were, each generation repurposing the materials and the footprints of what had come before, so that the streets of the town in Anselm's day followed paths whose original logic had been established by people whose names were entirely unknown, and whose reasons for choosing those particular lines through the landscape were buried under so many subsequent layers of use and modification. that reconstruction was impossible. The main road through the town ran roughly east to west, following the line of the valley floor, and the cathedral occupied a position slightly north of this road, set back from it by a square that served as market space on certain days of the week, and as a more general gathering place on the others, a kind of civic living room that the building presided over, with the calm authority of something that has been in the same spot for longer than anyone can remember. The river that gave the valley its old name ran along the valley's southern edge, close enough to the town to be useful, and far enough from it to avoid the flooding that had periodically troubled communities built too close to medieval watercourses. It was a modest river by most standards, neither wide nor fast-moving, with the gentle quality of waterways that have found their final path through a landscape, and settled into it with something like satisfaction, no longer testing their banks with seasonal ambition, but moving steadily and without drama within the limits of a channel they had shaped over centuries to suit themselves perfectly. In summer, the river was low enough in places to be crossed on foot without difficulty, and the children of the town used these crossing points as playgrounds, the shallow water and the smooth stones of the riverbed being exactly the kind of environment that children in every century have found irresistible. In spring, the river rose with the snow melt from the hills to the east and moved with more authority, its color changing from the clear pale brown of summer to the deeper gray-green of water carrying sediment from the hills. And during these weeks of higher water, the crossing points were submerged, and the town relied on the single stone bridge that had been built at the point where the main road met the river, a bridge of 5 arches whose construction had preceded even the cathedral by several decades, and which had been repaired and modified so many times across the intervening centuries that the original builders would have recognized only its location and its basic form. The road from the east entered the valley through a gap in the hills that the locals called the Notch, a name that accurately described the shape of the passage, a narrow declivity in the ridgeline through which travelers descended to the valley floor over the course of perhaps a half-hour's walking, the cathedral's towers becoming visible from the Notch on clear days as soon as you reached its highest point, a view that generations of arriving travelers had remarked upon in terms that varied in their eloquence but agreed in their substance, the towers appearing above the valley's rim with the quality of something that had been placed there specifically for the comfort of the arriving traveler, a visible assurance that the destination was real and reachable and worthy of the journey. Anselm had come through the Notch on his arrival in the autumn of his 22nd year, and the towers he had seen from that distance, pale against the October sky, were already the towers he would spend 47 years drawing, though he did not yet know this. And the view from the Notch that afternoon was simply the view of a young man arriving somewhere new, and feeling in his chest the particular mixture of relief and uncertainty that all arrivals carry. The farms of the valley occupied the slopes above the river road on both sides, arranged in the irregular pattern of medieval land use that followed the logic of soil quality and drainage, and the accumulated decisions of many generations about which fields were worth cultivating, and which were better left to the rough pasture that covered the steeper sections of the hillside. The farmers who worked these fields were not, for the most part, people who had much interaction with the monastery, which occupied a different social world from the agricultural community despite their physical proximity, but they were a constant presence in the valley's life, their seasonal activities providing a background rhythm that those inside the monastery's walls could follow from a distance. The spring plowing visible from the eastern corridor's upper windows as a slow darkening of the field's color, as the turned soil replaced the winter gray of fallow ground. The summer's growth filling the slopes with green. The autumn harvest bringing carts along the road below the monastery with a frequency that announced the season as clearly as any calendar. Anselm had watched these seasonal activities from his window for 47 years, and the sky above the fields was the same sky above the cathedral, and the light that fell on the slopes in the late afternoon was the same light that caught the towers in that last warm hour before sunset that he had drawn so many times, so that in a sense the drawings contained the valley as well as the cathedral, the sky's quality inseparable from the landscape that produced it. The town itself, in Anselm's time, was home to perhaps 800 people, which made it a community of moderate size for that part of France in that period, large enough to support a weekly market, and a small number of specialist craftsmen, but not so large that it had lost the quality of a place where people knew each other's names and circumstances, and the threads of individual lives were woven together in the way that happens in communities small enough to be comprehended whole. The cathedral served this community as more than a place of worship, functioning also as a landmark, a social gathering point, a source of employment for those involved in its continuous maintenance and care, and a kind of collective possession that the town regarded with a proprietary pride that was different from but not unrelated to religious devotion. The pride of people in a beautiful and permanent thing that they had not made themselves but that belonged to them nevertheless, that stood in their valley and was visible from their fields and would still be standing long after they were gone. Anselm, looking out his window each morning at the facade that the town regarded with this comfortable proprietary warmth, was in some sense drawing not just the building but the relationship between the building and the place. The way the cathedral held the valley's attention, the way a candle holds the attention of a dark room, not by demanding it, but simply by being what it was, steady and luminous, and completely at home in the space it occupied. And the valley is quiet now, as all valleys are quiet in the deep middle of the night, the river moving in its accustomed channel, the fields lying in their winter stillness, the road empty, the town dark behind its shuttered windows, and the cathedral rising above everything in the dark with the particular quality of large pale stone in moonlight, which is not quite luminous but is more present than darkness, a soft insistence of mass and form against the sky, patient as it has always been patient, as it will continue to be long after every other element of this night has changed beyond recognition. Rest now. The valley holds you the way it has always held everything that has rested within it, quietly and without condition. The hills on three sides and the river to the south, and the road running through the middle of it all like a line drawn by someone who knew exactly where they were going. In the final year of his life, Anselm's hands had changed in the way that old hands change, the skin thinning and losing the slight resilience that younger skin maintains even in cold weather, the joints thickening at their knuckles in the manner of hands that had spent decades in repetitive close work, the fingers retaining their dexterity but requiring more time in the morning before the stiffness that the night had deposited in them retreated sufficiently to allow the fine movements that drawing required. He had developed the habit, sometime in his mid-60s, of warming his hands before sitting down at the table, holding them cupped around the small clay cup of warm water that accompanied his morning meal, and keeping them there for several minutes, feeling the heat move through the skin and into the deeper tissues, the stiffness softening by degrees until the fingers moved with something closer to their old fluency. This small preparatory ritual had become as much a part of the morning practice as the drawing itself, a kind of preamble that the hands required, and that he had learned to give them without impatience, understanding that the accommodation of the body's changing needs was not a concession to weakness, but simply a different form of the same attention he brought to everything, the willingness to meet things as they were, rather than as he might have preferred them to be. He was 69 years old in the final year, an age that, in the 1500s, represented a life of considerable length, well past the point at which most of his contemporaries had concluded their earthly arrangements and moved on to whatever came next. His health had been, by the standards of the time and place, remarkably consistent across the decades, punctuated by the usual seasonal illnesses, and by one serious episode in his late 50s, when a fever had kept him in the infirmary for 3 weeks, and had left him, when it finally subsided, with a permanent slight weakness in his left side that affected his walking more than his drawing, and that he managed without complaint, in the same way he managed everything, by adjusting, by finding the new way of doing the familiar thing, by understanding that adaptation was not a defeat, but a continuation. The monks who remained in the community in those final years, most of them younger than Anselm by a considerable margin, regarded him with a mixture of affection and quiet respect that he received without particular acknowledgement, having never been a person who sought or responded to recognition with any more animation than he brought to other forms of external attention. The last autumn of his life arrived in the way all his autumns had arrived, with the smell of wood smoke and wet leaves, and the particular quality of October light that turned the valley gold in the late afternoons. and Anselm sat at his table and drew the cathedral in that light, as he had drawn it in every previous October light across 46 preceding autumns. There was nothing in the drawings from that final year that announced themselves as final, no perceptible change in the quality of attention or the character of the observation. The same western facade rendered with the same patient care, the same towers ascending into the same sky, the same great portal with its carved figures that he had been drawing for so long that his hand knew them better than his eyes did, and could find their positions on the paper without needing to look up and confirm what he already knew was there. If the drawings from that year carry any distinctive quality, it is perhaps a slight additional stillness, a quality of absolute settledness in the compositions, as if the hand that made them had arrived somewhere and knew it, had reached a point of such complete familiarity with its subject that the making of each drawing was less an act of observation than an act of recognition, the returning of something known to the form that best expressed its being known. The last drawing was made in the third week of November, on a morning that the monastery's brief records describe as cold and clear, the sky a pale blue of the kind that appears in late autumn, after several days of rain have washed the air clean of everything that might soften or obscure it. In this light, the cathedral stone was at its most precisely itself, the shadows crisp and the illuminated surfaces carrying a clarity that the gentler lights of other seasons did not produce. Every detail of the carved portal legible at the distance of the monastery window, the two towers casting long, sharp shadows westward across the square in the low-angled morning sun. Anselm had drawn the cathedral in this light many times before, and his hand knew what was required of it, knew how to render that particular clarity, how to use the charcoal with the light, confident pressure that the sharp light required, how to let the white of the paper carry the brightness of the illuminated stone surfaces without overworking the areas of light that always tempted the hand toward unnecessary elaboration. He worked for the usual amount of time, perhaps an hour and a half, perhaps a little longer, the morning advancing its usual way around him, the bells marking the first office and then the second, the faint sounds of the monastery going about its day reaching him softly through the closed door as they always had, the familiar ambient music of a place he had inhabited for so long that its sounds had become indistinguishable from the sounds of his own interior life. When he finished, he set the charcoal beside the drawing and looked at what he had made with the same unhurried consideration he had always brought to this final moment of each morning's work. The drawing was of the cathedral's western facade in clear November morning light, the towers sharp against a pale sky, the portal in crisp shadow at its recesses and bright at its projecting edges, the three upper windows rendered with the careful attention to their tracery that he had been practicing for 47 years, and that he had never, even now, managed to execute precisely as he intended, the stone tracery always resolving on the paper into something that was close to what he saw, but not exactly it, a permanent small falling short that had ceased to trouble him decades ago, and had become instead a kind of companion to the work, the evidence of the distance between the thing and its rendering, that no amount of practice could fully close. He looked at the drawing for a long moment. Then he placed it on the stack, with the same even movement he had used for every drawing before it, setting it gently on top of what the years had accumulated beneath it, and placed his hands flat on the table for a moment, in the posture of someone who has finished what they came to do, and then rose from the chair and went about the rest of the day. He died in the following February, in the infirmary, in the early morning hours between the night office and the dawn, in a season when the ground was too hard for burial, and the community had to wait for the thaw, which came in the third week of March, gentle and without announcement, the way all the best things come. The chest of drawings remained in his workspace, undisturbed, the last drawing on top of the stack in the cold room with its westward window. And outside that window, the cathedral stood in its valley in the late winter light, patient as it had always been, carrying in its stone all the winters and all the mornings that had passed before it, and all those that were still to come, unchanged and unchanging in the way that only very large and very old things can remain unchanged, while everything around them continues its quiet and unstoppable transformation. Marguerite spent 4 months with the drawings before she wrote her first formal report. a period that her supervisor at the regional archive regarded with mild impatience, and that Marguerite herself regarded as the minimum necessary to say anything about the collection that was worth saying. The drawings were transported to the archive's examination rooms in the wooden chest in which they had spent their centuries of waiting, carried with the careful deliberateness that such things deserve. And there they were laid out on long tables under controlled lighting and subjected to the various forms of patient scrutiny that archival has developed for the purpose of understanding old things without damaging them in the process of understanding. The paper was tested and found to be consistent with production methods common to the region in the mid-1500s, confirming what the drawing's own visual character had already suggested about their approximate period of origin. The charcoal was examined and found to be willow-based, the most common material for such work in monastic contexts of that era. The chest itself was dated with greater precision than the drawings, its hardware placing it firmly in the second half of the 1400s, slightly earlier than the drawings it contained, which suggested it had been made for another purpose and repurposed at some point as storage for Anselm's accumulating work, possibly by Anselm himself when the stacks of paper had grown too large for the shelf and the table to accommodate, without the organization that a dedicated container would provide. The question of attribution was resolved not through the drawings themselves but through the monastery's administrative records, which had survived in considerably better condition than might have been expected given the building's history of fire and reorganization, owing largely to the habit of successive abbots of keeping duplicate copies of important documents in separate locations within the building. In these records, across the decades that the drawings' paper evidence suggested as their period of creation, there appeared a monk named Anselm, referred to in various contexts as a copyist of moderate skill, as a reliable and quiet member of the community, as the occupant of a workspace on the second floor of the eastern wing, and as someone whose daily routine included what one abbot's notes described simply as his drawing practice, mentioned without elaboration in the context of a general account of each monk's particular activities, as if the practice was sufficiently well known within the community to require no further explanation, and sufficiently unremarkable in its to warrant no particular commentary. He appeared in the records first in an autumn entry consistent with the drawing's estimated beginning date, and he disappeared from them in a February notation that recorded his death in the infirmary, with the same sparse economy that the records applied to all such events: a name, a date, and the notation that the ground being hard, burial had been deferred to the thaw. The architectural evidence that the drawings contained proved, upon careful analysis by a specialist in medieval ecclesiastical structures, whom Marguerite consulted in the third month of her investigation, to be substantially accurate, and in several respects, genuinely valuable. The crack in the right tower's lower section, its appearance and subsequent repair, corresponded to a structural event that the specialist was able to cross-reference with a brief mention in the cathedral's own maintenance records, a mention so laconic that it had previously been considered insufficiently detailed to be useful, but that the drawings now gave context and chronology to, transforming it from an isolated notation into one point in a documented sequence. The modification to the upper window's tracery was confirmed by comparing the earlier drawings with the later ones, and then comparing both with the physical fabric of the building, where the careful eye of the specialist found, in the transition between two phases of stonework in the relevant section, the physical evidence of exactly the change that Anselm's drawings had recorded without knowing they were recording anything at all. The missing portal figure had been known to scholars as an absence, a gap in the original sculptural program that had been attributed to various causes across the years, and the drawings provided the first evidence of what had occupied that position, and of the approximate period during which it had been lost, information that was modest in its implications, but genuine in its contribution to the building's known history. What the drawings could not answer, and what Marguerite found herself returning to in the quieter moments of her investigation, was the question of why. Not why in the sense of what motivated Anselm to begin, since beginnings are in some ways the easiest thing to understand, the impulse of a young person newly arrived in a place toward the making of something that fixes the newness, in a form that can be returned to. The instinct to record what is seen before familiarity renders it invisible. But why in the sense of what sustained the practice across 47 years? What kept a person returning to the same window and the same subject with the same attentiveness through all the seasons and weathers and changes of the surrounding world, through the decades in which the practice was new and then familiar and then very old, through the years when the hands that served it were young and then middle-aged and then stiff with cold and slow to warm? This question did not have an answer in the documents. And Marguerite had been an archivist long enough to know that the absence of a documentary answer to a question about a person's inner life was not an absence of an answer, but simply an acknowledgement that some things are not recorded, because they cannot be recorded, because they exist in a region of experience that is prior to language, and resistant to the kinds of evidence that archives can hold. The drawings were eventually catalogued and conserved and placed in acid-free storage in the regional Archives climate-controlled repository, where they remained accessible to researchers who had reason to consult them, which over the years following their discovery proved to be a small but steady trickle of people. Architectural historians interested in the structural evidence they contained. Art historians interested in the draftsmanship and what it revealed about the development of observational drawing practice in monastic contexts. And occasionally, people who had no professional reason to be there at all, but who had simply heard about the collection and wanted to see for themselves what it looked like when a person spent 47 years drawing the same thing. These latter visitors were perhaps the ones Marguerite found most interesting, because what they were looking for was not information, but something harder to name. The same thing she herself had been looking for when she stood in that cold November room, holding two drawings side by side in the pale afternoon light, trying to understand what it meant that a man had given his mornings to this for the whole long span of his life, and had left behind him only this quiet accumulation of attention, no explanation, no commentary, simply the drawings themselves, each one the same facade in different light, patient and unhurried and complete. And perhaps that is the only answer the question admits of, the answer that is contained in the drawings themselves, and that each person who looks at them long enough eventually arrives at, in their own way and in their own time. The understanding that some things are done not for a reason that can be extracted from the doing and examined separately, but because the doing itself is the reason, because the morning given to the window and the charcoal and the familiar stone is its own justification, complete in itself, requiring nothing beyond itself to be what it is, which is simply a life attending to the world it was placed in, carefully and without haste, for as long as the world chose to keep it. And if you are still with us, still drifting in the soft dark, with the drawings spreading their quiet sequence behind your eyes, then you already understand this, because you have been doing the same thing yourself for the past 2 hours, giving your attention to a single quiet story in the way that Anselm gave his attention to a single quiet stone, and finding in that giving the same thing he found, which is rest, which is the particular deep rest that comes not from the absence of attention, but from the willing and unhurried offering of it to something worthy of the gift. The cathedral is still standing. It stands in its valley in the eastern part of France, in a region whose name has changed several times since Anselm walked through the notch in the hills, and saw the towers for the first time against an October sky. And it stands as it has always stood, with the particular quality of permanence that very old stone buildings possess, a permanence that is not the absence of change, but the accumulation of so much change across so much time that the building has arrived at a kind of equilibrium with its own history, wearing its centuries the way old wood wears its grain, as something integral to its rather than something applied to its surface from outside. The pale limestone of the western facade has continued its slow darkening across the centuries since Anselm last drew it, the stone that was cream-colored in his time having moved through stages of weathering, that have given it now a deeper and more complex tone, a layering of pale and gray, and the faint warm ochre that old French limestone tends toward in its matured state, a color that shifts in the way that all complex surfaces shift depending on the quality of the light that falls on them and the angle from which you choose to look. The two towers are as they were. The great portal is as it was. The three upper windows between the towers still hold their stone tracery, repaired and replaced in some sections across the intervening years, but maintaining the essential character of what was there, when a young man named Anselm pressed his face close to a second-floor window and decided, without knowing he was deciding anything, to draw what he saw. The monastery that adjoined the cathedral's eastern wall is no longer a functioning religious community, having passed through its various transformations across the centuries, and arrived in the present as a building that serves a different purpose from the one it was built for, as so many very old buildings eventually do, housing now a small administrative office and a modest library of regional historical documents, and the kind of quiet institutional life that is in some ways not entirely unlike the life it once contained. Still a place where people come to work with documents, and to sit in relative silence and to move through stone corridors that carry in their walls the accumulated experience of all the purposes they have served across the centuries. The second-floor room at the end of the eastern corridor, the room with the westward-facing window that looked out at the cathedral's western facade, is used now for storage. Its wooden table, long since replaced by metal shelving, its walls painted over so many times that the stone beneath the paint has become a memory rather than a surface. But the window remains. The same window, the same view through it. The cathedral's towers rising in the middle distance against whatever sky the current day has chosen to offer, as they rose for Anselm every morning for 47 years, and as they will continue to rise for whoever chooses to stand at that window in the mornings yet to come. The drawings rest in their archive, in their acid-free enclosures, in the climate-controlled dark, where things are kept when they have been determined to be worth keeping. They are consulted occasionally by the small, steady trickle of researchers that Marguerite observed in the years following their discovery. And they are what they have always been, which is the record of a life's worth of morning attention given willingly and without agenda to a single subject. A record that reveals its full only to those who are willing to spend enough time with it, to move through the sequence with the same patience that the sequence itself embodies, allowing the drawings to accumulate in the mind the way they accumulated in the chest, one morning at a time, each one the same, and each one different, each one the same Western facade in a slightly different light, on a slightly different day, in a life that was long and quiet and full of the kind of meaning that does not announce itself but simply deepens, year by year, in the way that stone deepens in the ground, in the way that a river deepens its channel, in the way that any sustained act of attention deepens the one who attends, and the thing being attended to simultaneously, each one changed by the other in ways that cannot be measured but can, perhaps, be felt. We are near the end now, and the end is a gentle thing, as all ends are gentle when they have been properly prepared for by the long middle that preceded them. The story has done what stories of this kind are meant to do, which is not to inform or to excite or to resolve, but to accompany, to be a voice in the dark that keeps the dark from feeling empty, that fills the quiet hours with the soft material of other lives lived in other times in other places. Lives that are in their essentials not so different from the life being lived right now in whatever room this voice is reaching. The same need for routine and for the comfort of the familiar. The same slow passage of seasons. The same quality of morning light on a surface you have looked at so many times that you have stopped seeing it, and have started, without knowing it, to know it. Anselm knew the cathedral's western facade in that way, knew it past seeing and into something deeper than seeing, something for which we do not have a precise word, but that the drawings express with a clarity that no word could quite achieve, the clarity of a hand that has been returning to the same place for so long that the returning itself has become the place. The devotion and its object having grown so intertwined over the years that they can no longer be separated into cause and effect, into subject and act, into the one who looks and the thing being looked at. The candle on the table is low now, its flame reduced to a small steady point that illuminates almost nothing beyond itself, and requires almost nothing to continue, only the last of the wax and the particular quality of still air that the deep hours of the night provide, an air that does not disturb the flame, but simply holds it, the way the night holds everything in these final hours before the gradual return of the light that will come, as it always comes, without announcement and without drama, beginning at the edges of the sky so faintly that you cannot say exactly when the dark became something other than dark, only that at some point The quality of the darkness changed, and went on changing until what had been night was morning, and the cathedral's towers were visible again in the early pale light, the stone carrying its first faint warmth from the east, the shadows long and soft across the square, the birds beginning their quiet inventory of the new day in the trees along the river road. Rest now. The story has done its work, and you have done yours, which was simply to be here, to be present in this particular dark with this particular voice, to let the hours pass in the company of a man who spent his mornings at a window, and left behind him only this, only the evidence of his attention, patient and unhurried and complete. The corridor is empty. The door is settling in its frame with the soft sound of old wood finding its position in the cold. The drawings are resting in their careful dark. The cathedral stands. And somewhere in the deep and comfortable silence that follows the end of a long story, the dust is settling, slowly and without sound, the way all things settle eventually, into exactly the place they were always meant to be.